Hello everyone, I'm Vivek Soundararajan. I'm the lead of the research initiative Embed Dignity. And so this is our first report, which is on the influence of sourcing practices on lower tier apparel supply chains. Why we wanted to understand the influence of sourcing practices on lower tier suppliers is that there is an assumption that the sourcing practices of brands can influence lower tier suppliers through intermediaries and exporters. We wanted to understand whether this is really the case. So we conducted a study in apparel supply chains focusing on India, and we try to understand what shapes the experiences of textile mills, which are lower tier suppliers in apparel supply chains. We found that the sourcing practices of brands did not have much of an influence on textile mills in India. And there are various reasons. They had influence on exporters, but then that influence did not cascade down to the textile mills. So we were surprised why this is happening, because there is always an assumption that the sourcing practices can influence lower tier suppliers or the whole supply chain. So we found various reasons for why the sourcing practices of brands did not have much of an influence on the textile mills. The first reason we found is that the textile mills are not directly contracted to the brands. So the exporters are the ones who get orders, and the exporters get yarn from the textile mills. A very little number of exporters or manufacturers are vertically integrated, and so there is no contractual relationship between brands and the textile mills. The second one is the textile mills acts as a separate industry in itself, although they're part of the bigger textile and garment sector. But although they're part of the sector, they act as a separate industry in itself, and in a sense that they have their own norms and policies, and which are different from the exporters who belong to the manufacturing segment. And an interesting thing that we found is also that not many exporters actually directly buy from mills. Rather, they buy from the intermediaries, who are yarn traders, who buy yarn from different varieties of yarn from textile mills and then give them to the exporters. Many exporters do not have direct relationship with the textile mills at all, so they can't influence the textile mills. On the fourth reason is that unlike the knitwear manufacturing process, which is not often standardized, you have multiple seasons and designs, etc. The spinning process is often standardized with certain measurements of yarn being produced continuously for the manufacturers, and some of these yarns are also directly exported, etc., which I will cover in the next section. The sourcing practices of brands do not have much of an influence in the everyday practices of textile mills. So we try to understand what other factors could influence the everyday practices of textile mills. Three major factors came up. One is the cost of inputs, mainly the cotton price, which is constantly fluctuating because of the international cotton market, but also the dumping of cheaper cotton from neighboring countries. The second major pressure comes from labor. The mills face a heavy labor scarcity. There is also a higher attrition rate within the textile mills. The third major pressure comes from the infrastructure. The electricity cost is increasing constantly, and some mills are trying to navigate this by establishing windmills, but it's a very expensive technology, so not every mill can actually do that. An interesting aspect of this study is that we often assume that top tier suppliers have more power than lower tier suppliers, and that they can actually shape practices of lower tier suppliers or control practices of lower tier suppliers. But in this supply chain, we found that it's not the case, in which the top tier suppliers are actually caught in between the brands who tell them what to do and they have to comply with their demands, but they cannot put pressure on lower tier suppliers because the lower tier suppliers in this case are more powerful and resourceful and have more control over resources and the price of inputs, etc. And so, which is very interesting and which also challenges a lot of assumptions about how we understand supply chains and power relationship within supply chains. In this report, we also offer a lot of recommendations targeted at brands, mills, policymakers, and civil society actors. And the report is free to download. Feel free to check the report and also send us your thoughts on the report. I hope the report is useful. Thank you so much.